welcome. Welcome. It is such a treat to see all of you here. It is so wonderful to have the theatre full of people that read and believe in the power of words. My name is Chris Gordon. I am the Programming Manager for Readings. It's a treat to be here with all of you from the safety of my own study. Before we get going, I want us all to celebrate and acknowledge that this week in particular is Nardok Week. That's a week that celebrates and acknowledges all the history and the culture of this beautiful country that we live in. It's a week that's very important because it celebrates the Indigenous owners of this land. This year, 2020, the theme is always was and always will be. And it's so important, isn't it, that we actually really, truly admit to ourselves that wherever we are in Australia, we're living on land that's not ours. It's not been ceded. It's stolen land. And it's a great privilege, I believe, and a pleasure to live in such a beautiful country, in a country where the culture has made sense of the way that they live through stories and songlines. And to that end, when I think about the story makers, the creators in our community, and how grateful I am to them for making sense of the way that we live, who we are, why we are, what we want to do. To that end, I want to introduce you to Maria Takolander. She's one of these women that has put her words wherever she can. She's a scholar, she's an interviewer, she's a poet, she's an essay writer, she's a novelist, she's a short story creator, and she's one of these women that makes it all look a bit easy. She's going to be talking to another woman that does that, and I'm hoping that tonight, wherever you are in Australia, that you too can learn a little more about the power that all of us have. To you, Maria, you're so, so welcome. Remember, we're in the theatre, so the applause, Maria, is a little overwhelming. You're going to just have to wait until it dies down.
All right. Yes, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Christine, for that very generous and warm welcome. I am delighted to be joining you all from Geelong, where the Wadawurrung people are the traditional custodians. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging their continuing bonds with the lands and waters here. I'd also like to begin by introducing you all to our special guest, someone who really needs no introduction. She's a living national treasure, as I've increasingly seen her described as, Helen Garner. And again, we'll leave some space for applause, Helen. So we're actually here tonight to celebrate volume 2 of Helen's diaries. One day I'll remember this. It looks like this, fantastic front cover. And I'm going to start with a hard-hitting and potentially triggering question for all the Melburnians watching. Helen, how did you cope with lockdown?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me about football.
I wouldn't do that.
I did cope, and coming out of it is worse than being in it, in a way. I found I got a lot of work done. Being a sort of an introvert, I like being by myself all day, and that just continued. And I got a lot of work done, and I did a lot of gardening and planted things. But it's only now that it's over, or almost over, that I realise how deeply affected I was by it. I feel as if age has taken a few big strides towards me. I feel a bit sort of timid and a bit sort of nervous about going out, and things that I did confidently before the lockdown I now find rather alarming, like going to someone's house, for example. It makes me feel quite nervous and exhausted afterwards. But I'm just grateful that I'm sort of incredulous and grateful that Dan Andrews kept our noses to the grindstone. I greatly admire him, and I won't hear a word against him. Voila.
Absolutely. Helen, I don't think it's age. I think a lot of us are experiencing that same kind of timidity when it comes to venturing out into the world and practicing those very tiring social skills again. So I
Like
don't think
laughing, yeah.
Moving on to these diaries, and I'm going to make a big call about them. I think that they're some of your best work, and that's saying a lot. Of course, we all know that, and I think they're also some of the best life writing that I've ever read. And for me, it combines a Lydia Davis-like artistry of the fragment and the everyday with the philosophical weight and physical heft of Knausgaard's memoirs. You know, you really do a beautiful balancing act when it comes to these diaries, in my view. And I have written down so many quotes from volume 1 and now volume 2 that I have my own notebook in progress. So look out, the publishing world. But in this volume, in this second volume of the diaries, you seem to intuit the special nature of what you're doing yourself. In an entry in 1989, you write, "What I love on my desk is the notebooks. Nothing serious I write can ever match these." So speaking as not only the writer of the diaries, but also the curator of these published versions of the diaries, what do you value about the work?
Well, I value its immediacy and its sort of shamelessness, I suppose, because they weren't written for publication. Obviously, to anybody that reads the diaries and who's read my other work will recognise things. There are things that are in some of my novels and fiction that obviously come straight from the diaries. I was quite surprised to have to find those passages almost word for word that I'd used. In, for example, the George Bark, there's various passages that come straight out of the diaries. But there's something about them that they're not trying to be anything. They're, when you sit up and you think, okay, now I'm writing a novel, and suddenly the whole history of English literature and every other sort of literature crashes onto your shoulders, and you think, God, nothing I'm doing is new, and what's the point of this? The world's full of books, and they've all been written, and what have I got to offer? But I know that if I at the end of the day, if I pick up the diary and I think, I'll just write down what I did today, and I just write down a few simple things, I get a feeling of, while I'm actually doing it, I get a feeling of extreme pleasure and satisfaction, partly because the thing I like best in the world really is writing. I actually like putting a sentence together. I like getting a pen and making some marks on a bit of paper. And so those activities are very calming to me, and that's, I guess, yeah, I suppose I could say that what I like about the diaries is they're not ambitious. You know, there isn't, I find in them anyway, there isn't a sense of strain and trying to do anything fancy or to create a structure. And that comes back to what you mentioned before about fragments, I suppose. The diaries do consist of fragments, some bigger than others, some of them are quite big. But I suppose what I'm saying really is that when I'm writing in the diary, I feel free. Free
of the obligation to please an audience or a publisher.
Yeah.
All of those things, yeah.
It's not aimed at the outside. Well, obviously, the very idea of writing anything down assumes a reader, but in a sense, when you're writing a novel, you're thinking about that a lot. You're thinking, is this going to make sense to people? Will this interest people? Will they think it's stupid? Have they read it all before in some other writer's work? Whereas if you're just sitting at the desk or sitting up in bed before you go to sleep and you think, I'll just write down about those tomatoes I planted, or what the weather was like today, or what that man said to me at the tram stop. And there's something simple about that urge. There's nothing ambitious about it. It's just the only ambition is to try to catch the thing as it flies.
And you also, I imagine, in that state write in quite an uncensored way. But I wonder, when it came to putting these diaries together in a publishable format, if some level of self-censorship kicked in, or some level of censorship designed to protect others. Is that what happened during the process of curating them?
Oh, yes. Well, I made an agreement with myself before I started the first one, that I wouldn't rewrite things, that I wouldn't shape them. I wouldn't try to. Basically, what I'm saying is that I thought all I would do would be to cut. And so I cut like mad. I cut and cut. But actually, I love cutting. I mean, that's my favourite bit of the whole activity of writing a book, is cutting. And I once I realised how important that is, and how much power you can get into a text by cutting. That was a very liberating thing for me. That's one reason why I was so crazy about Raymond Carver back in the 80s. And I know now that the cutting was done by his editor rather than by him. But there was some electrical current that absolutely shot through those brutally trimmed back short stories of his, and I found those enormously inspiring. And I still do.
And very exciting to read about your encounters with Raymond Carver the man, which appear in these diaries as well. But I mean, in terms of cutting and thinking about the structure of the published work, I wonder if you were thinking in terms of things like pacing or tone, because I do notice that whenever you write about your daughter, the tone is so different to when you're writing about men, or when you're writing about writing, and it's like this breath of fresh air that comes in and clears out everything that's fraught and difficult. So I suppose that made me wonder, are you thinking about balancing, tone or register as you're putting together these published diaries?
Well, I couldn't. Yes, it's true. My daughter, my daughter is the source of. She's taught me everything I know about love. Well, I did learn some other things later from her children, but she's a very precious person to me, and I love her very much. So at times of my life when everything was looking awful in all other regards, there was something refreshing about her, and so to write about her was an extra pleasure, because when you watch your child sort of blossoming before your eyes, there's something so wonderful and moving about everything that they do and say that it's a joy to write it down. But getting to the point which I think you're putting to me is, which is what you call curating the diaries, which is actually a term that I hadn't thought of until you used it. It's true that I had a sense, I wanted there to be variations of tone, because for obvious reasons. I mean, nobody wants to sort of drone on in the same tone on and on. But it does interest me when I go back and look at the notebooks to find how much variation of tone there already is there. And so when the order of events in the diary hasn't changed. It's not. I don't change that. I just cut pieces out, and the bits that still have a bit of a shine to them, or seem to be funny or moving, or that seem to be connected with the kind of narrative thread that I can feel moving through it. Those are the bits that I'm going for, and I'm hacking out all the undergrowth that sort of conceals or obscures their little sparkle that they have. But so I didn't really allow myself to reorder things in order to vary tone. If I thought the tone was getting too heavy, I just brought my axe in and chopped down a few trees and hauled them out. Stumps.
That's really interesting. And of course, one's daily life, particularly during lockdown, did naturally have ups and downs that I'm sure are reflected in any diary that might be kept. I'm going to return to the Nausgard comparison I made earlier. because I did find myself comparing your diaries with his memoirs, and which have been quite the phenomenon, and rightly so, in my opinion. I think that
yeah, marvellous. I haven't read them all. I think I read the first 2 or maybe 3. I thought they were wonderful.
Yeah, yeah. But what I realised when I was reading your diaries is how much more your work spoke to me than his did, which is to say that your diaries made me acutely aware, in a way I rarely am, of reading as a woman. So I was at home in them. I was at home with the intimacy, with the sense of humour, even with the ruthlessness of your observations about yourself and others. And of course, as I realised this, I wondered, I wonder what Helen would make of this experience. And of course, I mean, as these diaries reveal, you had to wrestle with the lesser status of being a woman writing about women's lives. So, I mean, how do you feel about that whole issue now? And perhaps it's simply you feel vindicated. I'm not sure, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I was quite surprised when I went back, and the things that jumped out of the diary when I went back and looked at them to put them together for publication was how much in the 80s particularly there was that, as a writer who was a woman, you would feel yourself not taken seriously, not scorned and rejected, but taken. I mean, things that I put in the diary, like the critic in the TLS who described my work as Mills and Boon for Bohemians, for example, which is one of those comments that actually leave a scar, much as it enrages me to say so. That was Howard Jacobson, by the way, who said that. That name just popped into my head this minute. It's not that I didn't censor that out of the diaries, but I was mortified by that, and I was. There's just a sense of, see, back then it was different. Back then, I mean, as you suggest, talking about being vindicated. I mean, I look around and see the number of women writers that are working wonderfully now, and back then, you felt smaller. You felt less respected. You thought, and of course that was partly coming from inside. Well, I'll talk about myself. I mean, when I got out of university, which was 1965 or so, I never thought then that I would ever publish a book. It never occurred to me that I would or could, because I thought all the real writers were that they all lived in America or were Europeans, and that you know, the really great writers were all men. And what did I think? I mean, not that I was ever aim to be a great writer, but just there was this massive, monumental load and huge thing behind that cast shadow, and we were told that writing about domestic matters was somehow slightly trivial, and it really it does affect you, knowing that those ideas are out there, and people going, you know, when Monkey Grip came out, people said, she's only published her diaries, what's all the fuss about? And so then I became defensive, and that's a terrible thing, to be defensive as an artist. It's about the worst thing that you can be, because you've got a chip on your shoulder, and you've got to clear that away somehow. But I don't know, just as the years go by, it's constantly been an amazement to me to think that people used to think that anything that happened in a kitchen or a bedroom was somehow of less importance than something that happened on a battlefield or, you know, those places that famous narratives take place. I do, because, well, I don't even need to argue it anymore. I might have once needed to argue that, but it's now changed, and the world has changed.
Yes, and it's absolutely clear when you read the diaries, by the impact that the work has on you as a reader, that this is stuff that matters. This is stuff that's profoundly important. the problem with men and women, it's one.
Here we go. Go on, tell me what it is.
It's kind of central to the work. You don't spare anyone, certainly not men, but not women either. You don't spare yourself. You don't spare your partners. And I just thought I'd bring up a couple of examples from the diary, a couple of scenes. There's an example, a seemingly trivial observation. There's been a house party and a young man, the so-called law student, yells at a female housemate who's busy cleaning up all the mess, "Stop acting the martyr, I'll wash up later." And after hearing this exchange, you reflect, boys who batten off girls use their sense of order as something to sponge off and then desecrate. Girls who let them do this. Just extraordinary. But there's a lot of that kind of dynamic in your relationship with your partner known as V, which forms the kind of central relationship in this volume. And he claims the writing desk at home, you leave and try and find somewhere else to write. Look, I felt bloody infuriated reading this stuff, I have to say, in part because I was forced to acknowledge that I recognised this kind of behaviour in my own history. And I mean, how did you feel revisiting it? Did you get angry?
I was furious. Well, more like, it's more true to say that I was ashamed. I mean, I had to actually force myself to put those things in because I'm ashamed. I mean, even when I think of it walking around, you know, if I suddenly think, geez, why has he actually left the house every day? And then I'm overwhelmed with the most severe mortification to think how abject I was. There's a kind of abjectness in those situations that I don't know why we women take the lesser part in that way and allow themselves to go on taking the lesser part. I think there's a point in the diary where I say something like when we've just set up a new place to live and I have to go out and find a place to work outside the house, and I say something like, I don't know how I can go on being so cheerful and unresentful about this when the little virus of displacement is settling itself deeper and deeper into my guts or being, or I can't remember what the noun was. But I sort of feel like I'd like to make an excuse for myself, and I haven't got one. But I can say that was my third marriage, and I thought, okay, I've stuffed this up twice. I must have been doing something wrong. See, this is a kind of real female reasoning. I must have been doing something wrong. So I don't know quite what it was. But maybe I wasn't unselfish enough. Maybe I put myself forward too much. Maybe and I started to sort of criticise myself and think how I could make myself a better person and a person who might be able to keep a marriage going or manage to sustain a long, intimate relationship, which is something that I now look back on my life and see that I've never been able to do. But I did feel that I had launched on it again, on another attempt to do it, and certain demands were made of me, and I went along with it. And it's sort of a mystery to me in a way. It makes me feel bad to think about it. I feel ashamed and sort of puzzled by it.
Well, I've been nodding furiously the whole time you're talking because I know from my experience and speaking to girlfriends and speaking to my sister, who I believe is watching tonight, that these kinds of experiences are ones that a lot of women can relate to. And I suppose this relates back to that earlier point I made, that I felt acutely aware of reading these diaries as a woman and that this was something that had been written for me.
Mm. Well, something being written for us, that triggers the thought. I think when people marry, it triggers in them an archetype, a series of archetypal behaviours, which are perhaps coming from they're about what marriage is in our society and what we've learnt that marriage is supposed to be, and we've internalised those archetypes, and then of course we've got our own parents' marriage, which has plainly deeply influenced us on an unconscious level. So it's not as if you're thinking, oh, I'll try and be exactly like mum was. I mean, there might be some people who think that, but I wouldn't have thought that, because I used to think my mother was like a doormat, you know. But then, I sort of start to turn myself into a doormat. But there always seems to be a reason for my doormatness. You know, I think, oh, well, yeah, I actually do quite like going out in the morning, and, I think of all these excuses. Yeah, it was a very mysterious process, and I don't enjoy thinking about it because I don't really understand it. But one thing I do know is that it's never going to happen again. For being nearly 80, I'll be 80 in 2 years. But yeah, it's amazing what you spared by old age.
You've finally broken free. Do you get the sense, Helen, that younger women, building on the work of feminists beforehand, are less inclined to take shit, to put up with the shit? I mean, I don't know. I'm not convinced.
I don't know. I do see that many younger women I know do seem to have taken up with blokes who are very different from the men that I knew in my generation. I don't know if they're blokes who've been raised by feminist mothers, or just that the feminism in the atmosphere they absorb by some osmotic process, and they think, well, I really have to learn to cook, or I'm going to have to share some, and I'm going to help to bring up these children. I'm not just going to let my wife or my girlfriend do all the work. Those assumptions no longer seem to be so simply made or so unconsciously made these days. But I'm sure that, look, sometimes I think the whole thing boils down to one fact, which is every man has a mother, with everything that entails. I mean, that's there's some relationship with the feminine or the mother archetype, or just women in general, that each man has to figure out for himself and create for himself. And you can see that some men find a way of doing it, and other men don't even think they haven't given it a thought. But it does puzzle and greatly interest me.
Yes. Well, I mean, let's hope a lot of men read these diaries too, and begin to see relationships.
Like that they can clean the toilet.
Yeah. Getting back to relationships, we haven't really left the business of relationships, but in your representation of your relationship with V, your husband, I felt I read a truer account of the complex psychological stuff that goes on in a relationship than I ever have. At the start, there's the agony and the uncertainty of desire, the childlike drive to get what you want, the pulling back to try and protect yourself in case you get hurt. Then there's the relationship itself, where a fight, in your words, is a naked struggle for supremacy. There are also more trivial provocations, like when V complains there's no food in the fridge, and you take him to the fridge and you show him there is in fact a container of soup, 3 French cheeses, etc. I mean, how I laughed so often when I was reading these diaries, and it was always a laugh of recognition. Look, you believe in love, but if you'll forgive me for saying this, Helen, you're not really a romantic. So.
No, I'm not. Well, I mean, I probably once would have thought I was, but there's a moment in the diary. I'm so pleased that you say you laughed, because I mean, when I was putting them together, sometimes I would just be in fits of laughter, thinking, "Did that really happen?" Well, I'll put it in, but I'll now forget what I've interrupted my point. What point was I going to make?
Are you a romantic? You were once a
Oh,
romantic.
yeah, a romantic. Well, there's a quote, I've quoted a verse of a poem by Yeats in the book, and it's one of Yeats's late, very short, very tough little poems. And basically he says, all true love must die, alter at the best into some lesser thing. And that's something that stuck in my mind when we were studied Yeats at university. That was back in the 60s. And I didn't really have much life experience then, but it struck me in that it's stayed in my mind. And when I looked it up to check I got it right for putting it in the published book, I found that the poem was called Her Anxiety. And so I realised that he was actually talking in the poem about what the woman was thinking. It wasn't him, the poet, wasn't he, the poet, who was saying all true love must die. It was the woman he's writing about who says that rather devastating thing. And in the diary, I was impatient with V, and I said, he seems to think that romantic love's going to go on and on. Hasn't he read Yeats? And then I quoted that line. And I think my experience has been that romantic love does die or turn into something which obviously for some people turns into something of great richness and beauty and mutual support. And that obviously just wasn't going to happen with me and V. But I have given that quite a lot of thought.
There's a great line too. I mean, in terms of this business of you believing in love and yet not being romantic, there's a point where you declare that V is the love of my life. And then shortly after that, you go on to muse that love is in fact a mutual simultaneous projection.
I said that?
Yeah. And I wonder if...
Yeah, well, that's what I think. Yeah.
I wonder if the kind of clear-sightedness that you have, the kind of ruthless honesty that you have, kind of gets in the way of having a relationship. And I wonder if you think relationships might rely on a bit of mutual delusion.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm reaching for this little scrap of paper that I just remembered I had on my desk. I've torn this out. This is a quote from something, I haven't sourced it. It says, of course, he made her up, as we all make up the people we love. I tore that out. I'm probably going to put it on a postcard and send it cynically to someone. But I think there's recently been republished a book by Phyllis Rose called, I forget what it's called, but it's about 5 Victorian marriages. Have you, Parallel Lives is the name of this book.
Yeah.
It's a marvellous book. It first came out in the early 80s, and I noticed that it's been republished, and that I saw a review of it somewhere, and it's got an introduction that a lot of young feminists have fallen on with gratitude, because it talks about, basically she's saying, it's really interesting to me how all relationships are power relationships. I don't think anybody would dispute that. But she says, it's interesting how she suggests that love is a sort of a willful suspension of that understanding. And she says, when we start to examine relationships, instead of looking at the power balance, we want to be spoken to about love, as if love is this kind of, it's a beautiful thing and a beautiful fantasy. And when you say I believe in love, I think it would be more true to say I think we're all we're in romantic love. It's like a kind of disease that's going to strike you, or it's a blast from the little god Eros that's going to come and blast to smithereens your setup that you thought you had, and then you fall in love, and it's almost always with the wrong person. But how do I get off on this tangent?
I suppose
what it's like to be 78. You lose your track. So you can steer me back onto it anytime you want to.
No, that happens to me all the time. I mean, I suppose what I'm asking is, looking back on your life and your writing life, do you think you chose a relationship with truth and art over a relationship with men or people? And how do you feel looking back at the betrayals, the lost friendships, one of which appears in this book? Is art worth it?
Yeah, my immediate response is yes. I think there is a choice. I was talking sadly to a good friend of mine, a very intelligent woman, recently about somebody that I'd fallen out with painfully, and I couldn't see how I could mend it with another woman in my life. And my friend said, well, Helen, she said, at a certain point, you chose art. Mm-hmm. And she just sobbed it to me, and I thought, for a moment it took my breath away. Because once I would have thought, oh, what bullshit, people don't choose art. They just live their life, and art is a bit of a sort of byproduct. But I used to hate all that romantic stuff that people spoke about artists and how, what sacrifices they make, and you just open a vein and bleed and all that crap. But I still think that's all revolting. But there are certain choices that you have to make if you're going to put everything you got into whatever your art form is. Something else is going to suffer. Doesn't necessarily have to be a person, but I think it often is. But and I don't think that means that. I don't think that gives an artist open slather. I hate that idea that an artist is supposed to think of nothing but art. That's all there is. That you just get, everything else just falls away. I don't think that at all. But there are certain. It's perhaps particularly difficult for women to make that choice because we are supposed to make peace. We're supposed to be the healers of things, and we're supposed to withhold our needs in order to maintain the general peace. And so much sacrifice has to be made by women. People wonder why there's so many, marriage is so shaken up these days, and such a lot of marriage ends in divorce. And I think it's just because women won't hack the shit that has been necessary to keep a certain type of marriage going. Women need to realise there are other things that they might do, and in a sense demand. And a huge rejigging of priorities has to go on around us if we're to have any kind of freedom to create.
Yeah, and look, I think a reader sees all of that in the diaries, and I'm grateful to you, Helen, to have shared all of these experiences so honestly. But I wonder what the experience is like for you. I'm intrigued, and maybe this is something to do with my Finnish background, but I wonder how you cope with being so public, with being so exposed. And I remember speaking to a Finn earlier in the year, and she has a very public job dealing with people every day. And I asked her how she copes with giving so much of herself away every day. And her answer was that she divides herself linguistically. She speaks in her public role in English, but in her personal life, she speaks in Finnish. And that's how she manages to preserve that bit of her private self for herself. Mm. Does that resonate at all with you? Is it a problem for you that, everything is supposedly out there, or is there a way that you find of protecting yourself somehow? Mm. Or is that cowardly to even want to do that? I'm not sure.
No, not at all. No, look, some people, I know there are some people who can't even read these diaries because they're so excruciated by. I remember one of my sisters once saying about something I'd written. She said she used to be a nurse, and she said, I felt I wanted to pull the screen around you. And I understand that, but I love it. I love to read other writers who don't pull the screen around themselves. You know, I mean, that's why, you know, one of the reasons why I really like Nausgaard so much, and Ferrante and people like that they just strip off those protective layers, and there's sometimes there's just like a quivering raw flesh underneath, but by the same token, I don't think I think some people would think that that's not art, which isn't a question that I ever trouble myself with. But it reminds me of, I saw Nausgaard on stage once. I mean, I saw it on video later. And he's such a gawky, great thing. You know, he came clunking in and he had his little tiny jackets that he wears that stick out the back because they're not the right size. And he was just being ordinary and talking to the interviewer. And then the interviewer said to him, asked him to read a particular passage of one of the books. And it was a passage in which his wife's father came to visit them. And he picked up the book and began to read. And I knew that his wife had been distressed by some of the things that he had revealed in the book. And, you know, I was sort of anxious about that. But he picked up the book and began to read the passage. And I was so bowled over by the way he read it. His whole casual sort of flip tone that he was taking in the interview just completely dropped away. And he read with this absolute clarity and sincerity and simplicity this passage about this man who's obviously was troubled with mental illness, who comes to visit his daughter and Nausgaard, their husband. And it was so wonderful and electrifying. I thought, this is the highest art, it's the highest literature. And yet it was a simple account of something that happened domestically in his family. And I was electrified by that. It was the most wonderfully liberating moment for me to see how, and it was partly, of course, because he had written it using all the forces of his skill and talent. He hadn't just whacked it down on the page, but everything about the scene was so delicately rendered, and yet it was just a simple account, but it had these echoing depths of suffering and tolerance, and it was a marvellous thing. And I feel that if it's possible to write about one's most intimate things in a way that makes them accessible to other people, so it's not just narcissistic display. And I feel very strongly about that. And that's one reason why the responses to this diary have been very, well, actually I haven't had many public responses to this volume yet, but to the first one, that so many people said, this could have been me. You've expressed something that I felt, or I have gone through those things too. And I had this feeling that I hadn't just kind of bared myself, but I'd taken steps towards other people in a really comradely way, and I felt their comradeliness in return. And it was, I mean, it can be very lonely being a writer, and you don't really know if what you're doing is any good or if it's worth all the groaning and that you're putting into it. But at moments like that, that's when I feel, when you ask if it's worth it, it is worth it to me, just for people to say, I read what you wrote and it really meant something to me. It could have been my life. And I think, I break into a sweat of relief at those moments.
I could say exactly the same thing to you, Helen. And in fact, I think I have. Your honesty and your artistry are electrifying. And I couldn't recommend this book more strongly to those of you who are listening, because I'd be surprised if, like me, you didn't also see yourself in this book in some way. We've come to the end of our time, unfortunately. I want to thank Chris and Readings for making this event possible. I want to thank everyone in their homes for joining us. And of course, I want to thank the magnificent Helen Garner for sharing her time and insights with us tonight. And I'll hand over to Chris to wrap things up.
Thanks, Maria.
Do you remember, everybody, how we were in a theatre? Now the house lights are heading up and everybody is clapping They're clapping because someone has the guts, Helen, to just talk, to just share. Thank you so much for doing that for us tonight.
Thank you.
With all of my heart, you know that. Maria, I think you're one of the extraordinary scholars and interviewers of our time. Thank you for your expertise and your warmth this evening. On behalf of Text Publishing, on behalf of Readings, to all of you out there across Australia, aren't we lucky? Aren't we lucky to have these women? Good night, everybody. Good night. Stay safe.